Right, good morning everybody and welcome to the last SAEON Seminar for 2021. Thank you for pulling yourself away from your end of year madness or your holiday plans, whichever they might be. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded and it will be on the YouTube channel at some stage. I think what I'm going to do, I'm just going to turn my video off for a second, and I'm just going to introduce the speakers for today. Caitlin's going to put up a slide for us. There you go. We got two speakers today. It's two postdocs from the Ndlovu node, Dr. Melissa Schmitt and Dr. Keenan Stears. Collectively, they've been working with me at Ndlovu for the past 5 odd years. Melissa completed her undergrad in the University of California, PhD at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2017. She then joined us as a Claude Leon Fellow until the middle of 2020. She's now moved across to the University of Mpumalanga doing a second postdoc, which is extending some of the work that she's going to be talking about today. And then Keenan has a PhD in ecology, also from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He graduated in 2015. In 2019, he joined the project that Melissa had started with us. He's an NRF-funded postdoc, and he ultimately became the lead on that project. He will be finishing up with us now at the end of 2021. They are both extremely passionate wildlife ecologists with a love for savannas and wildlife in South Africa and Africa in general. Melissa and Keenan are both currently in California. They both still have dual affiliation with the University of California in Santa Barbara. So they've provided us with a voiceover presentation. Because of that, there won't be any kind of interactive question time, but I will do my best to field any questions. But I do encourage you to put any questions or comments into the chat or jot them down, and we can get those to Melissa and Keenan after the fact and provide feedback if necessary. So great. The title of the presentation, it's a bit of a mouthful: Integrating Herbivore Distribution, Assemblages, and Vegetation Structure to reveal optimal strategies for managing biodiversity in the face of global change. Right, enjoy it. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We're really excited to share some of our research with you during the SAEON Seminar series. I first want to start by introducing the research program that Keenan and I have been running with a number of collaborators over the past few years, which is called Project TREE. Project TREE stands for Tritrophic Relationships in Engineered Environments. This research program is specifically focused on understanding ecological relationships that occur within managed savanna ecosystems. We're particularly interested in the relationships across and among the trophic levels of vegetation, herbivores, and the predators of those herbivores. We then want to place these relationships in a bigger picture, so we're ultimately interested in understanding how environmental disturbances or changes in woody vegetation influence the behavior of large mammals. We're also interested in scaling up from these behavioral interactions to both population dynamics and ecosystem processes within savannas. Savannas are a wide-ranging biome around the globe. In the map from Pennington et al. 2018, which you can see there at the bottom of the screen, all of the areas in yellow represent savannas and grasslands. And globally, savannas cover about 20% of the total land surface, and within Africa, savannas cover more than 50% of the continent. Savanna ecosystems are not only important for their ecological roles, but they also provide a wide range of ecosystem services to humans, including providing grazing areas for livestock production, firewood, and also conservation areas that support a thriving ecotourism industry. Savanna ecosystems themselves are composed of a mosaic of trees and a herbaceous layer. However, there's natural spatio-temporal variation in woody structure. This variation is shaped by both biotic and abiotic processes such as fire, rainfall, geology, and herbivory, as well as the interaction of those factors. Importantly, the variation in woody plant cover can occur both within and among savanna systems. For example, the image on the bottom right of this slide really illustrates the variation of woody plant cover one might see in a given savanna. Savannas host a high diversity of large mammal species. For example, there are numerous predators which differ with respect to their hunting styles, including cursorial species, which chase down and tire their prey, as well as ambush predators, which rely on structure in the landscape to stalk their prey. With respect to herbivores, they span a range in body sizes from small-bodied stambok to mega herbivores such as elephants. Moreover, these species can fall into one of three feeding guilds: grazers, browsers, and mixed feeders. Habitat heterogeneity has been found to strongly shape animal diversity across systems, and in savannas, the variation in woody plant cover creates habitat heterogeneity, which ultimately allows for such a high diversity of large mammal species to coexist. However, variation in individual traits of both predators and prey, whether it's the hunting style of the predators or the body size and feeding guild of the prey, interact with woody plant cover to shape patterns of habitat use. Specifically, herbivores face a risk and reward behavioral trade-off, whereby they must simultaneously balance food acquisition while avoiding predation risk. And woody plant cover plays a very important role in this trade-off because it simultaneously influences predation risk as well as food availability and quality. So in the eyes of a herbivore, areas with high woody cover are often perceived as risky because visibility is low for prey to spot predators and then escape, but the vegetation itself also provides ample ambush sites for stalking predators. Thus, any changes to woody cover will likely alter these relationships and influence herbivore habitat use. One major source of change to woody plant cover in savannas is bush encroachment or woody thickening. While savannas span a natural woody plant gradient, woody densification leads to a shift towards thicker habitats. And the drivers of this densification are fairly well studied and include global drivers such as increases in CO2, as well as local drivers such as changes in land use, fire regimes, and grazing practices. And while the drivers are fairly well studied, the consequences of densification are less well studied, especially for the large mammal community. Woody densification is occurring in savannas globally. However, specifically in Africa, we've seen a fairly dramatic increase in woody plant cover over the last 30 years. In the figure on the top left from Fenter et al. 2018, you can see significant densification, which is denoted in green, which also covers a large portion of the continent. Thus, it's critically important to understand the impacts of densification on the large mammal community. Moreover, we really hypothesize that any changes to woody plant cover will influence herbivore habitat use and their distributions across the landscape. We would also expect that the community level responses will be dictated by species-specific traits such as body size and feeding guild. So the broad aims of this project are to understand how the large mammal community responds to first a gradient of woody plant cover, and then increases in woody plant cover, and finally decreases in woody plant cover as a result of management actions. Finally, the major aim of this study is to apply our findings to inform better management actions.
So Melissa has now provided the theoretical framework behind why woody plant cover is important in shaping herbivore habitat use. So the three questions that we wanted to address in our research are as follows. The first is, how does woody plant cover influence herbivore habitat use? The second one, how will climate-induced changes to woody vegetation influence herbivore distributions? And then finally, how does vegetation management that is aimed to combat increased woody plant cover influence herbivore community responses? And to address these questions, we conducted our study at Mala Game Reserve, which forms part of a larger conservation area, because it is open to both the Sabise and Wildtuin, as well as the Kruger National Park. Our study site is approximately 13,300 hectares in size and consists of a mixed Combretum terminalia ceracea woodland. The study site also has a diverse predator and prey guild. In terms of vegetation management at our study site, this will be directly addressed a little bit later in the talk. But in terms of water management, it is kept as natural as possible in our study site. The Sand River is the main source of water for wildlife, and there is no artificial water provisioning provided on the property. The few dams that do occur on the property are scattered across the property and are rain-fed. The purpose of this is to maintain the natural movements of wildlife across the landscape. For our first question on how does woody plant cover influence herbivore habitat use, we predict that the overall patterns of herbivore habitat use for the herbivore community as a whole will follow this unimodal response. And the highest use of habitats will occur in habitats that have an intermediate woody plant cover. While we expect a unimodal response for the herbivore community, we also expect a guild-specific response in herbivore habitat selection. And these patterns, when averaged out, will result in the overall unimodal response of the herbivore community. And we also hypothesize that herbivore body size will influence herbivore habitat use. Small herbivores should select for specific habitats because they are sensitive to risk as well as nutritional requirements, whereas larger bodied species should be less selective. To address our first research question and to test our hypotheses, we first had to identify a metric to measure herbivore habitat use. And because we were interested in the community level response of herbivores to a woody plant gradient, this metric needs to be able to quantify herbivore habitat use for the entire herbivore community. Secondly, we wanted to create and test this herbivore habitat use model using the above metric. And finally, we wanted to assess the drivers of herbivore habitat use. To measure herbivore habitat use for the entire community, we developed a novel approach of using game trails. This is a fixed wing image taken of our study site showing the distribution of game trails across the landscape. Now, while there are many game trails shown in this image, I'm just going to point out a couple of these game trails with these green arrows, and the dark gray objects across the landscape are actually trees, and the areas between the trees are grass-dominated habitats. And so we explored the use of game trails because they are used by the entire herbivore community, but also most importantly is that they're not randomly distributed across the landscape. They actually reflect the decision-making process of herbivores. And also, game trails can actually be identified across a range in woody plant cover. Now, because using game trails is a novel approach, we first needed to actually determine if it is a good metric for herbivore habitat use. The green lines on these images are actually the game trails, and you will notice that the number of game trails differs across these two habitat types, and most importantly, a woody plant gradient. The top image can be considered high use, with quite a number of trees in the habitat, and the bottom image can actually be considered low use, with little to no trees. And so ultimately, when we compare the distribution of game trails across a woody plant gradient with a known metric of herbivore habitat use, such as dung counts, we find a very similar unimodal response. The top figure shows dung counts on the y-axis as a function of a woody plant cover, and the bottom figure, we have game trail length on the y-axis as a function of woody plant cover. And so the unimodal response shows that peak habitat use, whether it is measured by dung counts or game trails, occurs within very similar woody plant cover. Thus, game trails are actually a good predictor of herbivore habitat use, and they represent a landscape scale footprint of behavioral interactions that can explain herbivore habitat use. So now we actually have a tool that we can use to estimate herbivore habitat use for their whole herbivore community. So we can use this game trail to develop a herbivore habitat use model. And to do this, we hand traced every game trail in 200 1-hectare sample plots that were distributed across our study site. We then analyzed the length of these game trails against a number of remotely sensed environmental data layers. Because we were particularly interested in how herbivore use is influenced by woody plant cover, we first created a 5-year NDVI layer. We used NDVI as a metric for woody plant cover. And NDVI has actually been used to quantify woody cover in a range of different systems, but we wanted to actually determine if it was a suitable metric for our own study site. So to do this, we plotted the relationship between NDVI on the y-axis and actual measurements of tree density on the x-axis across 52 sample sites. And what we found is that there was actually a very strong relationship, which shows that NDVI is a suitable metric for woody plant cover at our study site. The other environmental variables that were included in the model were distance from rivers, distance from dams, and distance from drainage lines. We included these variables because they can influence both food availability and quality, as well as perceived predation risk. And ultimately, this links back to this risk and reward trade-off and the influence that this trade-off can actually have on herbivore habitat use, which was mentioned by Melissa earlier. And so ultimately, the goal of this model is to scale up from these sample plots to create a landscape scale prediction of herbivore habitat use. And so this is the final product of our model. This is the predicted landscape scale pattern of herbivore habitat use for current conditions of woody plant cover. There are current conditions because we created the NDVI layers from data from 2015 to 2019. And the herbivore habitat use on this figure is measured as game trail length per hectare. The dark color on the map represents high use areas, whereas the lighter areas represent low use areas. So now that we have this landscape scale pattern of herbivore habitat use, we needed to ground truth this model. And we did this using a two-step approach. First, we ground truth the predicted herbivore habitat use model under current conditions of woody plant cover. We did this using animal census data collected from the same time period that corresponds to the NDVI layers used to create this model, 2015 to 2019. And then we plotted this data across this modeled landscape. We then calculated herbivore selection based on their location in 3 model predicted categories of high, medium, and low use. And so this approach allows us to actually ask the question of whether herbivores are actually selecting predicted high use areas over other predicted lower use areas. So the second approach was to ground truth the model through time using a hindcasting approach. This approach allows us to determine if we can get consistent predictions in actual herbivore habitat use with changes in woody plant cover. So to do this, we just needed to create new NDVI layers for the different 5-year periods between 1995 and 2014, and all other layers within this model stayed the same because there's no artificial water provisioning on the property, so there's no change in the distribution of water over time. And again, we plotted animal census data from each time period on the respective modeled landscape. And finally, for each time period, we calculated herbivore selection based on their location in 3 model predicted categories of high, medium, and low use. And what our results show is that our model does a good job of predicting herbivore habitat use under current conditions of woody plant cover. But most importantly, our model also accurately predicts herbivore habitat use with changes in woody plant cover. And overall, we found that herbivores are selecting for model predicted high use areas. And in the top right figure, you can see that across time, there is changes in the spatial distribution of high use habitats. And with herbivores consistently selecting for these high use areas, this result really shows that herbivores are tracking the changes in the spatial temporal distribution of high use habitats across the landscape. And ultimately, because we use different time periods, we can assess herbivore selection over time as a function of the proportional availability of a given habitat. Here we have herbivore habitat selection on the y-axis and the proportional availability of high, medium, and low use habitats on the x-axis. And when we actually plot these relationships, 2 important patterns arise. First is that the selection of high use habitats is always higher compared to the selection of lower use habitats. And the second pattern is that the degree of selection for high use habitats is influenced by the proportional availability of high use habitats across the landscape. Where in contrast, the selection for medium and low use habitats is relatively insensitive to changes in the proportional availability of these habitats. And why this is so important will become evident in the next section. And so when we go back to our initial predictions, we found that our results did not actually support these predictions, that both feeding yield and body size would influence herbivore habitat use. In fact, not only did we find that the herbivore community overall followed this unimodal response, but we also found that herbivores of different body size and feeding yields also followed the same unimodal response. So ultimately, we found that all herbivores, irrespective of their traits, selected for predicted high-use habitats of intermediate woody plant cover. And moreover, what we found is that this unimodal response of the herbivore community is driven by the risk and reward trade-off. Specifically, we found that in high-use habitats, herbivores had significantly lower vigilance levels and spent proportionately more time focused on food acquisition rather than risk avoidance. And in contrast, in low-use habitats, herbivores had significantly higher levels of vigilance and spent proportionately more time on risk avoidance rather than on food acquisition. So now that we have a good understanding of how woody plant cover influences herbivore habitat use, with this foundation we can now determine how climate-induced changes to woody vegetation will influence herbivore distributions. And so in the previous section, we developed and ground truthed our model and found that it was a good predictor of herbivore habitat use. So we can now use this scenario model to forecast changes in herbivore habitat distributions with an increase in woody plant cover due to climate change. To do this, we will use the same framework that I mentioned earlier, but to relate herbivore habitat use to changes in plant cover, again, all we really need to do is alter this 5-year NDVI layer that represents different conditions of woody plant cover. We altered this layer to represent a 10%, 25%, and 50% increase in tree density. And we were able to do this because of this relationship that I showed earlier. And for this model, all other environmental data layers remain the same. And a 50% increase in a tree cover may seem quite extreme, but it's actually been predicted that this can potentially occur within 70 years. So in other words, this can happen within a lifetime. And so when we plot the predicted herbivore habitat use models in response to climate change, we show that the distribution of herbivores is going to change with an increase in woody plant cover. And we also show that woody densification will reduce the amount of preferred high-use habitats across the landscape. And this finding is critically important when we interpret this in the context of this figure that I showed earlier. So this figure shows that as the proportional availability of high-use habitat declines over time, herbivore selection for the remaining high-use habitat will increase. So when we combine this pattern with our previous findings, we show that with an increase in woody densification, all herbivores, irrespective of their feeding guild and body size, will congregate in small fragmented patches of high-use habitat.
So this brings us to our next research question of how does vegetation management to combat increased woody plant cover influence herbivore community responses? So up to this point in this talk, we've really focused on how herbivores respond to a gradient of woody plant cover as well as increases in woody plant cover. But now we're going to shift our focus to understand their responses to decreases in woody plant cover as a result of management actions. To maintain woody plant structure, as well as combat densification, land managers have a variety of techniques that they can implement. The first is fire, which is commonly used to maintain and combat increases in woody plant cover. However, its efficacy in reducing already dense areas is debated. The second is mechanical tree clearing or brush clearing. This technique is highly effective at reducing woody plant cover and is implemented widely, not only across Africa, but in savannas around the world. And while it's used quite broadly, the outcomes with respect to the responses of the large mammal community are not well studied. So to explore this, we focus on areas where extensive tree clearing has occurred. Our study site has long-term management areas where tree clearing occurred 50 to 60 years ago and then have been maintained with annual mowing ever since. These managed areas are not only individually large, many of them are greater than 100 hectares, but there are also many of them spread across the property. And in these areas, the majority of woody vegetation has been removed, and all that remains is the herbaceous layer. And you can see an example of what one of these areas looks like on the bottom right of the screen. It's also important to note that these tree cleared areas, while they are dominated by grass, they're not analogous to grazing lawns. So this brings us to ask the question, how does vegetation management to combat increased woody plant cover influence herbivore community responses? Thus far, we've demonstrated that herbivore habitat use has a unimodal response along a woody plant cover gradient. Specifically, we find that at either ends of the spectrum are low use, and areas of highest use are at intermediate woody plant cover. So with large-scale management practices that homogenize woody plant cover to create grass-dominated tree-cleared areas, we would ultimately predict that these areas would also be low use. However, one aspect that also has to be considered is how herbivore species richness and abundance also scales with a woody cover gradient. Ultimately, we predict that processes that create the extreme ends of the woody plant gradient will result in herbivore assemblages that are low in both species richness and abundance. So within this research question, we have three key objectives. The first is to determine whether savannas have distinct herbivore assemblages that occur across the woody plant gradient. The second is to establish whether there are distinct assemblages that vary across seasons. And the third is to compare herbivore assemblages in managed areas with those in other habitats along the woody plant gradient. So to relate herbivore assemblages to woody plant cover, we first conducted driving transects. We drove 40 kilometers a day for 40 days in both the wet and dry seasons and enumerated all the herbivores we encountered along our transects. This resulted in the wet season, us counting just shy of 10,000 individuals from about 1,500 herds, and in the dry season, just over 9,000 individuals from about 1,300 herds. And all of the herbivores we encountered, we then assigned them to one of 6 woody structure categories. And these categories ranged from open tree cleared areas all the way through to dense thickets. We then applied statistical clustering of the data using the 12 herbivore species and the 6 vegetation structure groups as the inputs. This approach simultaneously incorporates both the herbivores and the vegetation structure to ultimately create what we call configurations. Configurations we define as distinct combinations of herbivore species that are associated with differing woody plant cover categories. And importantly, the outputs from our model predict where along the woody plant gradient each configuration has its highest probability of occurrence. So what we find is that savannas do in fact have unique configurations, which are characterized by differing woody plant cover and distinct herbivore assemblages. In our system, we found 11 different configurations, including multiple that have their highest probability of occurrence in the same habitat type. So this means we found distinctly different herbivore assemblages that could occur at their highest frequency in a given habitat type. We also found that configurations varied across the wet and dry seasons. Now, before I outline the configurations we found, I first want to orient you with how I'm going to present them. The 11 configurations, A through K, are listed along the top. These configurations are organized along the woody cover gradient, which is illustrated by the schematic at the bottom of the screen. So for example, the configurations that are within the black box both occur in the open managed areas. Any configurations that occur in the wet season will appear in that top green box, and any configurations that occur in the dry season will appear in the brown box at the bottom. So with respect to the tree cleared managed areas, we found 2 configurations that occurred here, configurations A and B. The configurations are represented as radial plots that show the relative abundance of each species that occurs within a given configuration. Each of the colored bars relates to a specific species, and the length of the bar relates to the relative abundance of that species, scaled to itself within a season. So what you can see here that is of the 2 configurations that have their highest probability of occurrence in cleared areas, one occurs only in the wet season, configuration A, while configuration B persists across both seasons. Now, both configurations have relatively few species, and for the most part, the relative abundance of the species found within these configurations are not particularly high, and that's with the exception of Stambok in configuration A. However, you'll see in a moment that Stambok actually achieves similar relative abundances in configurations that occur in other habitats too. So this is not the only configuration where Stambok are abundant. If we now shift our attention to the other end of the woody plant spectrum, we also find two configurations that occur in thickets. And again, these configurations are characterized by having relatively few species at relatively low relative abundances. However, if we now shift to look at the configurations that occur between the extreme ends of the woody plant gradient, we see that these configurations are characterized by having relatively more herbivore species. And for the vast majority of these species, they achieve their highest relative abundances in configurations that span from open canopy savannas to closed canopy woody savannas. It's also important to note here that you may notice that for some habitats, there are no configurations listed for a given season. A good example of this is semi-open canopy savannas in the wet season. And this does not mean that there are no herbivores in those habitats. It simply means that no configuration had its highest probability of occurrence in that habitat type in a given season. Okay, so when we go on to explore patterns of species richness across the configurations in the wet and dry seasons, we find a similar unimodal response as we did for the habitat use model that Keenan presented earlier. Again, we see that at either ends of the woody plant gradient, configurations host the lowest species richness, and then the highest richness occurs in habitats of intermediate woody cover. One important thing to notice is the shift in peak richness from the wet season into the dry season. So in the wet season, this occurs in woody savannas, and then in the dry season, this peak shifts to occur in closed canopy woody savannas. So when we go on to explore herbivore abundances across the configurations in both the wet and dry seasons, we find almost the exact same pattern. And again, we see the shift in peak abundance from the wet to the dry, and again, shifting from woody savannas to closed canopy woody savannas. And this shift likely reflects the seasonal changes in the risk and reward trade-off, with herbivores shifting to thicker habitats to take advantage of food resources that occur there. One important thing that these results highlight is the importance of relatively dense habitats for the herbivore community. So ultimately, when we compare herbivore responses to tree-cleared managed areas compared to other habitats, we find that whether managers take aggressive measures to reduce woody plant levels to extremely low levels, or they take a more passive response which allows for densification to create thickets, these result in equally depauperate herbivore assemblages. And importantly, neither the managed areas nor the woody thickened areas harbor a critical or unique species. So there's really no gain from the herbivore community perspective to manage for these habitats. Finally, our results really point towards managing for a range of habitats that span the woody plant cover gradient while avoiding the extreme ends of the spectrum. This not only captures the highest number of configurations, but it also captures the highest diversity of large mammal species.
Now, to conclude, we show that herbivores respond similarly to a woody plant gradient, and that these patterns are shaped by the behavioral risk and reward trade-off. But it's also important to put these findings into a much larger, or the bigger ecological picture. We show that herbivores respond to a woody plant gradient, and more importantly, we show that disturbances that create open or densely wooded habitats result in depauperate herbivore communities. And so it is important to understand how this process can influence larger scale ecological processes, as well as population dynamics of both predator and prey species, and ultimately how these interact to influence broad patterns of biodiversity. And by combining the various approaches that we talk about in this presentation, we show that low use areas have low species richness and abundance, and that high use areas have high species richness and abundance. And that these patterns really highlight the importance of managing for a diverse range in woody cover while avoiding the extremes of the woody plant gradient. And so our methods also highlight the importance of current and future management and the identification of potential areas of concern. Our predicted model highlights that the southern part of our study site is going to experience the greatest level of woody densification with climate change. Moreover, at our study sites, managers have actually incorporated these findings into their adaptive management plans and are actually moving away from maintaining these large-scale tree-cleared areas, as well as preventing habitats from shifting towards thickets by focusing on their fire management. And we are working with these land managers to monitor these changes through time. And in summary, we've created 3 really powerful approaches that can be applied to savanna management. The first is developing a technique for using patterns of game trails to assess habitat use at a landscape scale. And what is important about this technique is that the images that we used are freely available. So this framework can be applied quite broadly. Secondly, we implemented a modeling approach to forecast the effects of woody densification on herbivore habitat use. And finally, we developed the configurations framework to assess patterns of species richness and abundance across savanna habitats. Finally, we'd like to thank the various institutions, organizations, and people that supported and contributed to this research. Finally, we're not there to actually take any questions, but please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Thank you.
Right, let's, if there's any questions or comments, please feel free, direct them to me now and I'll help if possible. Otherwise, jot them down and we'll send them through to Keenan and Melissa for comments. Floor's open. Nobody? No comments or questions, suggestions, concerns? Okay. All right, then let me just finish up. I see Johan's popped on the screen. Johan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, look, there's so much in this presentation, and I thank the 2 speakers for a very comprehensive approach, and obviously also bringing a lot of innovation into the science. But as with any new approaches and so on, there will be questions. And, you know, one of the things that's probably simple to answer for you, not so complicated, is you're using game counts as a reference, but game counts, that's a seasonal thing. It only happens in the in winter, in the dry period. So the question is, are you happy to extrapolate over the full course of a year, over all 4 seasons, by using game counts that were done in the winter season, if I'm right? But yeah, that's one of the questions I would have for now. Thanks.
So we are fortunate in that the site where Melissa and Keenan work, Mala, is obviously very well supported financially, and they do game counts more than once a year actually. So the data that went into the kind of the ground truthing of the model was across seasons. It wasn't just for the dry season. So yes, we are happy that what we're using is rigorous.
Thanks.
Yeah, Julia has put a comment there in the chat. She says, just wondering, so as the habitat changes and these preferred areas become more limited. She's just wondering how flexible species might be in their behavioral and in their choices. And I mean, I think that is something that will only become apparent with time. But certainly that the results presented in terms of the unique configurations, I think gives a nice framework, a nice theoretical background to understand how species like to associate and how they choose their habitats. So we can perhaps forecast a little bit as to how species associations might collapse and how some species may not be that flexible or that tolerant of the new conditions. Okay, if there's nothing else, I would just like to thank Keenan and Melissa in their absence for the presentation and also for the amount of hard work they've put in over the years. Our next SAEON seminar will be by Glenn Moncrief, who will be talking to us on the 21st of January next year. And he'll be educating us about the use of machine learning for vegetation monitoring. So until then, I wish everybody a safe and love-filled and peaceful holiday season, and see you all in 2022. Thank you.